From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today, K-State's Sarah Lancaster will visit about what's new in herbicide options for you row crop producers as spring draws near. Sarah also talks about label changes that you producers should know about. And Britton Rucker has two more interviews from that 2020 Midwest Cover Crops Conference last week near Kansas City, including one with Sarah on cover crops as a means of weed suppression. Britton also talks with the University of Nebraska's Paul Jasa about improving soil structure via cover crop production. Later on, K-State's Charlie Lee talks about the repeal of the 2015 Waters of the U.S. rule and the implications for wildlife wetland resources. Here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today as we look ahead to another cropping season here in Kansas and the Central Plains. As usual, during the off-season, there are developments in the weed control world that are worth knowing about as you plan out your herbicide strategies. We've invited by, once again, Sarah Lancaster, weed management specialist with K-State Research and Extension, to share what she's been talking up on the meeting circuit, the various crop production schools that K-State has been conducting over the last several weeks. Just generally, Sarah, are there a lot of new developments in the realm of herbicide availability and usage?
As far as truly new herbicide molecules go, there's not a lot of activity in terms of products being released to the market. We've seen a handful of new premixes of existing products. And also, the other thing I've been talking with folks about this winter has been some of the new requirements for paraquat handlers and just reminders about some of the things to keep guys out of trouble if they choose to use the extend and enlist system.
Well, let's go right to that. And you bring up paraquat and some of the new requirements regarding usage and what producers have to adhere to. What are those basically new regulations?
Right. They're all centered around safety and safe handling. A little bit of background, the EPA was reviewing paraquat, and a lot of those human safety issues went back to improper storage. So handlers of paraquat for the 2020 season going forward need to have a certificate showing that they've taken a Syngenta-approved and EPA-approved training on proper handling and storage of paraquat.
Everybody who would utilize the product has to go through that then?
Yes. So in order to handle the product, you should have this certification. It's a strictly online certification program. It's required every 3 years. You know, it's really not that long. It takes maybe 30 minutes or an hour to do. And really the main focus is keeping handlers safe and also keeping unaware individuals in the area safe as far as storing the product properly.
But as far as that training itself, is it, to your thinking, fairly manageable for producers? It's online.
Absolutely. It is, something you have to make some time to do. But when I did mine the other day, it took about 30 minutes. There are a couple of video modules and then a short quiz. I think it's like a 10-question quiz at the end. It's not terribly cumbersome or terribly onerous for a handler.
All right. But as far as actually applying the product, there's not much new in a regulatory sense, in a label requirement?
Label application rates and things of that nature. Really, there's no changes. Other label changes would be a few updates to PPE requirements, particularly focused on keeping paraquat from exposure through the eyes and then accidental inhalation.
But again, it's back to personal operational safety.
Yep, it's just safety.
So that's on paraquat and some changes there. You also put out recently, actually, an article in the E-Update series on dicamba. Have we seen some label adjustments there?
The biggest thing on dicamba is just a reminder that training has to be done every year. There are still a few opportunities left. If a person is interested in face-to-face training opportunities, and those have been posted on an E-Update, and a lot of the district and county agents are doing a good job of pushing that information out to their producers. But there's also a web-based module for that training as well, for the plant growth regulator herbicide training. So that can be done through Bayer, it can be done through BASF, either online or in person.
And again, that is to address the drift concerns associated with dicamba.
Yes, the main focus there is understanding the factors that can be manipulated and managed to try to reduce the off-target movement of those products.
And it's incumbent upon all producers utilizing dicamba to be serious about that, given the circumstances regarding this herbicide over the last few years.
Absolutely. Dicamba-tolerant soybeans have given producers a very effective option for controlling some very troublesome weeds. But with that very effective tool comes some responsibilities for growers to make sure they're following requirements in terms of the time of day of application, weather conditions at the time of application, nozzle selection, tank mix partners, and other key factors.
So be sure to, if you haven't already, secure that training for dicamba applications if you're employing that product this coming growing season. And the Enlist herbicide option for producers who are going that direction with those seed technologies, what's new, if anything, there?
So Enlist E3 soybeans will be more widely available this year. Preliminary research data suggests that the 2,4-D is going to be an excellent herbicide for control of some problematic weeds in soybean as well. Some of the requirements for Enlist and the Extend system are similar. There are buffer requirements. There are also requirements for nozzle selection, time of day of application. However, quite frankly, 2,4-D is much less prone to volatility than dicamba, and also soybeans are much less sensitive to 2,4-D than they are to dicamba. So there are some things that are appealing about that Enlist system. However, it is going to still be in the minority as far as acreage where it's used this year, is the impression that I'm getting. Mm-hmm.
Even so, if one does turn to that trait and uses it this year, they need to be cognizant of these particular regulations regarding this application, even if it is, quote, a less risky proposition.
There are still regulatory requirements and training requirements for using this product. They are still relatively mobile herbicides in the environment, particularly in the air. And so there are still some responsibilities that growers need to take to make sure that we're just being good neighbors. Mm-hmm. We want everybody to have the opportunity to grow the systems that they want to use. And so that means being good neighbors and being responsible stewards of the products.
You bet. Now, you tell us, Sarah, that there are a handful of new premixes available to producers this coming season?
Mm-hmm. There are 2 herbicide premixes that have been brought to my attention. The first one is Pixaro. We'll just start with that one since we've been talking about plant growth regulating herbicides. Pixaro is a tank mix of Elevore, which is a plant growth regulating herbicide, and Starine, which is also a plant growth regulating herbicide. So the primary market target for this product is actually wheat production systems. It does have a 14-day rotation interval to corn and soybeans. So, depending on the mindset of a producer, there could be some opportunity to incorporate that in early season burn down programs, depending on weed spectrum and other conditions.
And as you look at that one and its intended targets, where do you see that being most advantageous?
So some of the weeds that it's targeted towards include kochia, mare's tail, and then flicksweed, so some of those mustard species that we talked about the last time we were together. Mm-hmm. So again, knowing the importance of early spring or fall weed control for things like kochia and mare's tail, I think it could have a good fit in that type of system.
Very good. And another premix is out there that producers could become familiar with?
The other premix that has been discussed with me is a product called Perpetuo. That label is not actually out yet, but it's expected for 2020. And Perpetuo is a premix of Zidua and Resource. It's going to have labels for both corn and soybean, but the primary target for that is in that role of an overlapping residual product for soybean production. So it's a good product potentially to put in as a residual herbicide in your tank mix with your post-emergent herbicide application. So the target weed species there are our friends the pigweeds, water hemp, and Palmer amaranth.
And as troublesome as those two have been, you think this particular combination could give a producer something of a leg up on those?
It should, based on the components, it should be a good product for controlling water hemp and Palmer.
So there's always something new every year as we enter another cropping go-round in as far as weed control alternatives. In closing, Sarah, producers should seek out as much information as they possibly can on what we've talked about here today and any other products that they may be intending to use. Be sure that they're acquainted with the requirements, the restrictions, the regulations.
Absolutely. As we are really in a time that agriculture is getting a lot of attention and on the environmental front and in other ways, it's important that producers make sure that they are aware of label requirements and restrictions for their safety and for environmental concerns as well. So being up to date with labels, calling and asking questions of me or of their county agents, reviewing the chemical weed control guide, things of that nature.
Sarah, thanks for being with us and for hanging with us when your voice hasn't been cooperating as it normally should. We appreciate the information and your time, as always.
Thank you, Eric.
Sarah Lancaster, Weed Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And this is Agriculture Today.
Kansas farmers and ranchers are helping feed your family in the world. The largest contributor to the Kansas economy is beef cattle. How do you get that juicy steak on your plate? In order for you to enjoy your tasty meal, it requires the hard work of the producers, marketers, advertisers, processors, inspectors, transporters, packers, and consumers. So thank all these people and sit back, relax, and enjoy your tasty meal.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. I'm Britton Rucker. The Midwest Cover Crops Council annual conference took place just last week right outside Kansas City. The Midwest Cover Crops Council aims to effectively achieve the broad adoption of cover crops by farmers and build a vital and effective regional collaboration of agencies, individuals, and the general public. Sessions looked at using cover crops in row crop production, livestock and grazing, as well as environmental and economic issues. One of the featured speakers of the morning sessions included Paul Jasa, agricultural engineer from the University of Nebraska. Paul, you discussed selecting and managing cover crops. Although some and most cover crops are used to provide grazing opportunities, you focus on improving soil structure.
It's true. When it comes to cover crops, they've been around for years as a grazing crop, and that's where producers add value to having a cover out there. The public is interested in reducing erosion, protecting water quality, reducing the sediment showing up in our waterways, and that's where the public has done a lot of funding of cover crops through various government programs, the soil and water conservation districts, and so on. But when it comes to what we're actually doing is I'm looking at improving the soil, feeding the soil system. It's the carbon dioxide in the air that's free. It's the sunlight that comes down on the earth is free. We harvest those by growing a plant, and that plant is putting root exudates into the soil, and those root exudates then are building our soil by feeding the soil microbes for us.
Now, you really went into kind of three main structures of managing water, intensifying the cropping system, and then feeding the soil system.
Correct. A lot of farmers think, when it comes to water is my limiting factor on crop production. Well, it comes down to what's the timing of the water. If I've got too much water in the soil profile, I'm not going to store my next rainfall event, why not grow it into a cover crop rather than lose it to deep leaching or to runoff? And so I can use that to manage excess water. On the other side of the coin, if I don't get enough rainfall, but I have a lot of evaporation because my soil's not protected, I can grow something to keep the sun and wind off the soil surface and conserve water. And so again, that water management becomes an important player. The key is I'm going to grow something and not lose it.
And timing of planting plays a huge role in the success of your cover crops.
Mother Nature's an opportunist. If I don't plant something, Mother Nature will have something growing. Even on my lawn, my garden, just like a farmer's field, if there's an empty space there, Mother Nature's going to grow something. It's usually what we call a weed, but it's cover as far as Mother Nature's concerned. Well, if I let the harvester leave the field and I've got soil there, let's plant a seed right away so Mother Nature doesn't have to.
Now, another thing that you really focused on is cover of your cover crop plays a huge role in collecting moisturing and the success of your cover crop once again.
It's true. The cover itself, again, is harvesting carbon dioxide and sunlight, and so I need to have as much ground cover as I can to protect that soil surface. Any sunlight hitting bare soil is wasted energy. It's going to heat the soil up. It's going to actually help kill some soil biology by heating the soil up and dry the soil out. So again, cover and a combination with residue to protect that soil makes a big difference. Now, as such, though, my covers are just enough to sort of catch all the sunlight. I'm not looking at raising tons of biomass to feed livestock. The livestock producer is going to manage his different. He's going to plant it different. He's going to plant different species, for instance, maybe a higher seeding rate. Expect it to use water and expect it to use some fertilizer because he's growing feed. That's going to be managed different than me feeding the soil.
Now, Paul, you have 15 plus years of experience in this field, and you've seen a lot of change, I can imagine. And one of the big changes in cover crop advancement is the equipment.
It's true, though. When it comes to cover crops, the early days, the cover crop was a single crop seeded into no competition at all. And it was maybe a cash crop replacement or seeded after the harvest of a cash crop. The equipment evolving now is, we can seed the cover crop sooner before cash crop harvest. That gives us more growth in the cover to give us more of an overlap between the cash crop and the cover crop. So now I'm getting some high clearance equipment to go into a growing crop, get the seed to the ground. Or it's going to be early in the season as a companion crop. And again, I'm going to protect my cash crop, not plow it out of the field while I'm planting my cover crop. And again, too many farmers say, I'm not going to plant the cover, it's going to damage my cash crop. Well, properly managed, I can do it.
And Paul, where do you see the future of cover crops headed?
I think the cover crops are going to be what we consider in some circles farming in nature's image. Mother Nature doesn't grow a single species in one place. There's always diverse species growing in a mix. Now, the diverse mix is what we're going to do with cover crops. We're going to do a companion crop with, say, a legume growing under our corn to fix some nitrogen for the corn, but more important, feed the soil system itself. We're going to be looking at covers as that extra species to help the system out.
That was Paul Jasa, agricultural engineer from the University of Nebraska. Another featured speaker at the conference was Sarah Lancaster from Kansas State University. And Sarah, you spoke on weed suppression from cover crops, and that really can play a huge role in the success of your operation.
Cover crops absolutely can play a huge role in the suppression of weeds, Britton. One of the things, from my perspective, that is very important in terms of cover crops and weed suppression is how cover crops can play a role in helping us to manage some herbicide-resistant weeds, particularly things like Palmer amaranth, water hemp, kochia, which are some of the major weeds in the state and also have pretty widespread herbicide resistance across the state. So cover crops absolutely can be beneficial in terms of suppressing the growth of those types of weeds. When you think about growing cover crops for weed suppression, it's important to think about biomass production by that cover crop. So in general, grasses, cereal rye is one that is used a lot for this purpose. Grasses tend to be pretty aggressive growers and produce a lot of biomass that can then turn around and suppress weeds. if you're looking for a spring planted crop, something like oats, also provides a lot of weed suppression, but also brassicas to some degree that can produce a lot of biomass.
Now, planting is also a huge factor in consideration of cover crops.
Yes, so when we think about managing weeds with cover crops and planting date, one of the key things to think about is when will your target weed emerge? Because you want to make sure that you have that cover crop in place before that weed emerges, so that cover crop will effectively outcompete that weed for the resources that are needed.
Right. And then termination is also a thing you discussed here at the conference.
Cover crop termination is always a question for crop producers, especially in Kansas, where we have such a variety of moisture conditions that interact with that cover crop termination date to affect not only weed control, but the overall productivity of that crop production system. When we think about managing cover crops for weed suppression, the general rule of thumb that comes out from the data is that the closer that you are to the time of planting your production crop, the better weed management or weed suppression you'll have from that cover crop. So you allow it time to accumulate more biomass. It's also actively competing with those weeds for a longer period of time. How you choose to terminate your cover crop doesn't matter. So if you're in a situation where you would like to reduce reliance on herbicides and terminate your cover crop with a mechanical method like rolling, then that's okay as long as you have your timing correct.
You had some trials at K-State.
Right. We did have some trials at K-State. They were focused on how can cover crops help us to manage particularly herbicide-resistant palmer amaranth and water hemp. The treatments they used in those studies, they had row crop cultivation, they had row spacing of soybean and grain sorghum, they had cover crops, they used a winter wheat cover crop, and then they had chemical weed control. So when we look at those management factors and we think about row crop cultivation, for example, it had very little effect on weed management when averaged across the other treatments. When we consider row spacing, it was pretty variable in terms of the response of the pigweed growth to row spacing of sorghum and soybean. It was very dependent on production environment. When we think about cover crops, it's also dependent on environment because those cover crops are changing the soil conditions in which your weeds are germinating. So in years that were, for example, particularly dry, cover crops actually sort of helped our pigweeds a little bit. In years where it was average or maybe wet, we had better suppression of the pigweeds with those cover crops. Now, the good thing about these particular studies is they included some effective herbicide programs. And so if you find yourself in a situation where your cover crop doesn't control your weeds maybe the way you want it to, we still have those herbicides as an option in some situations.
That was Sarah Lancaster from Kansas State University at the 2020 Midwest Cover Crops Council Conference that took place just last week right outside Kansas City. I'm Britton Rucker, and this is Agriculture Today. We'll return with more right after the short break over the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network, now in our 96th year of broadcast service to agriculture. Eric Atkinson with you. Now today's agricultural news headlines in brief, courtesy in part of DTN. A federal jury has determined Bayer and BASF should pay $250 million in punitive damages and $15 million in actual damages to a Missouri peach farm in response to allegations that the orchard was damaged by off-target movement of dicamba. The jury's verdict came after 3 weeks of testimony in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Bader Farms filed the suit back in 2016, blaming Monsanto, which of course was then purchased by Bayer in 2018, as well as BASF, for the scenario that allowed dicamba to move from neighboring fields and damage peach trees. Bader Farms is the largest peach grower in Missouri. They list more than 1,000 acres of peaches and 110,000 trees. That farm also grows other specialty crops and row crops. Bayer immediately responded with an announcement the verdict would be appealed, and BASF intends to also appeal the decision. How that penalty would be split between the two companies, should the verdict remain, is undecided. There are about 30 other cases filed involving dicamba or the Extend crop system. That's the trait platform that allows cotton and soybeans to withstand applications of dicamba. A Bayer spokesperson said that this decision will have no impact on the commercial availability of XtendiMax or the Extend system. It will be, they say, broadly available yet this spring. Environmental groups challenging the EPA's repeal of the 2015 Waters of the U.S. rule have asked a federal court to stay the case. In court documents filed on Friday in the U.S. District Court for the District of South Carolina, the groups said the EPA's actions in finalizing the new rule recently may change their legal strategy. The parties agree that holding this case in abeyance for 75 days would allow the parties time to evaluate the new rule. The EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers signed that final new rule on January the 23rd. It's set to take effect 60 days from that date. Following the repeal of the 2015 WOTUS rule, environmental and conservation groups filed a lawsuit on October 23rd. Filing the lawsuit, the Natural Resources Defense Council, the National Wildlife Federation, and others. Now, agricultural interests said at the time that the lawsuit was problematic because if the court ruled that the agency should have promulgated the 1986 rule again, instead of just reverting back to it, the 2015 rule could have gone back into effect until the EPA completed the rewrite of the new rule. A number of agriculture and other interest groups, led by the American Farm Bureau Federation, filed a motion to intervene in the case. And the biggest U.S. dairy farming cooperative has struck a $425 million deal to buy dozens of plants from bankrupt milk processor Dean Foods. That's a deal executives say would preserve jobs and markets for farmers' milk. That deal would see the agricultural cooperative take over the bulk of Dean's plants, following the top U.S. milk company's bankruptcy filing in November. And that takes us right into this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning how prices measured up in 2019 and maybe a little bit about where we might be headed as we go into 2020. So we look back at 2019, actually milk prices on farms were up compared to 2018 numbers, about 12%. We averaged about $16.70 per hundredweight if you look at the statistical uniform price. So how does that measure up since 2000 when we implemented the current milk marketing program? Well, the low point was 2002 at $11.24 per hundredweight, and the high point was 2014 at $22.90 per hundredweight. So we're about average. The average over that period has actually been $15.51 a hundredweight, and again, that's on the statistical uniform price formula. We ended 2019 about $1.20 over what the overall average is over the last several years. As we look at that number, how does this also compare in terms of the total number of pounds that we produced in that same period of time? Actually, our total amount marketed on the federal order was actually down about 8% from what it was in 2018. We've pooled a little less milk on the order during the 2019 year compared to 2018. So other highlights that we might pull out of the data as we look over the last year, and one that I think is just really really profound, actually, is where we're at on somatic cell count. Our farmers across the central order continue to do an excellent job of managing mastitis on their farms and lowering the somatic cell count that we see in the milk that we're shipping on the order. In fact, as we ended 2019, our average somatic cell count on milk pooled on the order was just under 200,000. It's excellent considering as you look back over the years and go back to when the order was first put together, at least the current program in 2000, we were averaging about 350,000 over the year. So we've really done a nice job of bringing those counts down. So hats off to our producers for all the hard work that goes into actually making that happen on our farms. Some other things that we might want to look at as we look at the 2019 data would be how the milk was utilized. In the central order, that milk, as far as Class 1 utilization, about 30% was used for Class 1 utilization. That would be for milk that would be utilized for fluid. In our case, that was a little bit less than what we did in 2018, so basically unchanged, but just a little bit less. As you look at Class 3 utilization in the central order, we averaged about 40% was used for Class 3 type products. So really those numbers are fairly similar to what we saw in 2018, not any great differences there. As far as the amount of milk that we pool in central order compared to other milk marketing groups around the United States, the amount of milk pooled on the central order ranks 5th amongst the other marketing orders. We are behind what is pooled in, say, the upper Midwest, which pools the most milk of orders pooling milk. Also just behind California in the amount that they are now pooling on the federal orders. So this is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, just giving you a quick update on how things looked in 2019 as we move forward in 2020. Don't expect too great a changes in terms of production or prices. I think they're going to be fairly stable, maybe fairly similar to what we saw in 2019.
Thanks, Mike. And this is Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social-economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and around to time now for our weekly visit on wildlife management with Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Well, it made the news here recent weeks, the new rule issued on the waters of the United States under the Clean Water Act. And Charlie, you're going to share a wildlife management perspective on this in reviewing the new rule. But the Clean Water Act in and of itself has been a churning issue for a long time.
Yes, I think the Clean Water Act has been controversial since the time of its existence. There's been litigation about the rules and regulations that enact the Clean Water Act, and I think they're going to continue. Each revision seems to try to clear up issues and problems, but it's very difficult to get consensus, particularly on something that seems to have been as controversial as the Clean Water Act. The environmental groups and conservation groups claim that this existing rule, which was just done on January 23rd of this year, which will go into effect 60 days after it was published, would reduce protection on 51% of the wetlands. Now, we've talked many times in the past about how important wetlands are and how good a job they do at filtering our waters, how important they are for the ecological chain of letting microorganisms start all the way up the food web, and how important they are for the threatened endangered species that seem to find those wetland environments so very important. But at the same time, we hear from other groups that say those regulations that were repealed last October that promoted the 2015 President Obama regulations, that they were overprotective. Some estimates said that 95% of the waters and wetlands of the land area in Missouri would have been regulated. 99% of the waters and wetlands of the land area in Pennsylvania would have been regulated under that guidance, and 97% of those in Iowa. I've not done as thorough a review of this recent water protection rule, but it seems to me that what has happened is that they've taken and repealed the 2015 rule, which means they wanted to go back to following the 1986 regulations. But the 1986 regulations were actually more broad than some of those regulations in 2015. So many people are promoting this as a win for the developers, for farmers, for energy companies. Those on the conservation side of things seem to think this is going to be devastating. I suspect that the truth is somewhere in the middle, but already there are many groups lining up to file lawsuits about this new navigable waters protection rule.
Well, it might be instructive right here to go over what you identify as 4 main provisions of the new rule.
This rule does a good job of outlining 4 simple categories of what waters are jurisdictional. The territorial seas and the traditional navigable waters are the first one. Next would be tributaries, then lakes, ponds, and impoundments, and then finally adjacent wetlands. Now, those are very simple categories, but there's certainly a lot of nuances associated with each one of those categories. This new rule provides clear exclusions for federal control of many water features that traditionally have not been regulated. In particular, features that only contain water in direct response to rainfall, many ditches, including farm and roadside ditches, prior converted cropland and farm and stock watering ponds, and waste treatment systems. So it also does a fairly good job of making some definitions, including some of the rules on prior converted cropland, and it defines what prior converted cropland is for the first time in this final rule. I think the agencies involved here, which would have been the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Army, clarify that prior converted cropland exclusion will cease to apply when cropland is abandoned for agricultural purposes for 5 years and has reverted to wetlands. There was a consortium of aquatic science societies, which is a group of 9 professional societies that's got over 20,000 member scientists. They've strongly criticized this new category. They think that it removes protection from millions of stream miles and acres of wetlands, that they expect impairment at the headwaters and wetlands is going to impact negatively water quality and flow for entire watersheds, and that overall the waters of the United States will lose protection, thus undermining our nation's water quality and fisheries.
So, as you said earlier, this will probably trigger more legal action, and it's important that folks, you say, understand the new rule in its entirety, that there may be misconceptions about it out there.
There are certainly a lot of misconceptions, and as we dig more deeply into the rule, it's quite extensive. We will find out that those things that have been thought of as facts perhaps may be myths or misconceptions. Keep in mind that everything that has water doesn't make it a wetland. But one important thing is out of this one is that the federal authority has also decided to allow states to protect wetlands on their own.
So in sum, agriculture, as you said, has looked at this as a victory in that it identifies what isn't a wetland more definitively, or what aren't jurisdictional waters, providing relief for agriculture. But you're saying that viable wetlands may be compromised here likewise.
I think that we will probably see some reduction of protection. Just to what degree that is will depend on some of the finer details that I've yet to review.
Well, once again, it's going to be in the news yet from here forward, without a doubt, as there are still some opposing viewpoints on this new rule on the waters of the United States, which was issued by the Environmental Protection Agency under the Clean Water Act just recently. And Charlie, thanks for the viewpoints right here. Charlie Lee is a wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. That brings our Tuesday edition to a close. And as always, we thank you for being along with us and invite you right back here this same time tomorrow. Until then, and for Britton Rucker, Eric Atkinson here, this has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.